Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. I'm very excited for today's guest. Chris Irvin, the Ketologist, is a former collegiate athlete and sports performance coach who received his master's degree in exercise and nutrition science from the University of Tampa and a bachelor's degree in biology from Illinois College. Chris is an expert at taking complex ketosis research and turning it into actionable and digestible information. He also co-authored with Danny Vega and Rachel Gregory the 4-week Carnivore Keto Cut program for helping people achieve various health goals with a carnivore keto diet, which I personally purchased and love. Chris also has an excellent blog and Instagram page, both branded as The Ketologist, which I've learned a lot from. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, would love to just talk a little bit about carnivore versus keto. And maybe the best place to start is just kind of what brought you into the world of carnivore, coming from a ketogenic background and what got you interested in it.
Yeah. So when I first started keto, which was about 3 to 3.5 years ago, I was following the pretty traditional standard, 70 to 75% fat, 20 to 25% protein, and, 5% or under on carbohydrates. And, I was doing the whole thing being very focused on getting a lot of vegetables and a lot of fiber into my diet. And, that went really well for a long time, especially coming from a standard American diet. That was a pretty good transition. I noticed a lot of changes, really liked the way that I felt and everything. And after a while, I kind of started shifting my goals, and I went through a period where I was trying to just test different theories. I'm kind of big into the self-experimentation. I really like to test, different theories and stuff out that I have on myself and see how it pans out and use that to make recommendations. So I went through a period of time where I was trying to, put on a little bit more muscle. I was training a little bit harder in the gym, was trying to improve my performance. So I started flirting with a higher protein version of keto. So I was still following a ketogenic diet that, still had a lot of vegetables and fiber and everything in it. But I was starting to get more into that, 30 to 35 up to 40% range for protein and a little bit lower fat. And I really noticed a lot of improvements in my body composition from that. I really liked it. And after doing that for a while, I kind of put that in my tool belt as an effective strategy for if I wanted to achieve a certain body composition goal. And then probably about a year ago, I first heard about carnivore, and it was actually from Danny, who you mentioned at the beginning of this. But Danny had kind of plugged me into carnivore and told me about it. And I saw that, really it was pretty similar to the high protein version of keto that I was following. It was just, removing the plant-based material altogether. So I really liked it. When we built the Carnivore Keto program, we put a couple tweaks in there. There's a couple things that I do and don't like about the standard Carnivore Keto approach, but the diet as a whole, I really enjoyed it. And, I jumped on it for the first time earlier this year, right before we actually put out that program. I gave it a try as we were developing it so I could kind of better understand it. And, the first month I did it, I lost, I think, 18 or 19 pounds, really felt great. It was one of those things where I wasn't really even trying to go for this goal of weight loss, and it just kind of happened, and it was pretty awesome. So, that was my first experience with carnivore, and I just really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's excellent. And would love to dive in a little bit more to protein versus fat macros, and how you think about that now, in a minute. But first, I wanted to address one thing you brought up, which is some of the tweaks you have to sort of a standard, pure muscle meat carnivore diet, that you include in the program. Can you talk about a few of those?
Yeah. So one of the biggest changes that we made in the program was in the oils that we added. So, we recommended things like avocado oil or coconut oil, MCT oil, stuff that's, definitely not animal based. But One of the reasons for that was that for some people, getting enough fat in the diet is still important, even on a carnivore diet where it's a little bit higher protein. So we didn't want those people to be relying really heavily on just consuming a ton of dairy because, I feel like that's probably the way that people go. They have their meat sources and stuff, but if they need to get more fat, they start looking at things like cheese and, cream and all these different things. So we wanted to avoid that because I'm just not under the impression that having a ton of dairy in the diet is really good for anybody. And maybe most people shouldn't be consuming too much of it. So that was one of the biggest things that we put in there. And then outside of that, a couple other little tweaks we recommended were things like adaptogenic mushrooms and stuff that could provide people with a little bit of a cognitive boost without having to rely heavily on caffeine. We knew that some people were going to be coming through this program the first time. This could be their first time to keto, or maybe they're using this to bust through a plateau. And, anytime you make a big dietary shift, you can see a little bit of a dip in your energy. And we didn't want that to mean that people had to start relying heavily on coffee. So we started recommending some of these adaptogenic mushroom coffees that you see out on the market because we thought that was a pretty good way to, just give people energy without having to rely on caffeine. And exogenous ketones was another thing that we plugged in there too. So there was kind of just a few supplements and stuff like that we like to put alongside of it that we think helps optimize it. When we first put that program out, we had a lot of people that gave us some heat on that, saying, that's not carnivore and stuff. But we really felt like we were doing our part to make it maybe a better optimized version of carnivore that more people could follow. So that was kind of our intention with that.
Yeah, that's great. And I personally don't implement some of those things, but I think, with the goal of a 4-week cut, it makes a ton of sense to sort of put those training wheels and band-aids around it to make things easier for people, especially, the point you bring up about fat is great. You definitely don't want people just adding loads of butter to their steak to hit their macros during this cut program. So I think it just makes a lot of logical sense to include the oils in that case. For someone who's not specifically dialed in going after a certain weight goal, and is just more eating carnivore for the long term, it might not make sense to add those oils, but I definitely understand with the objective of the program to try to facilitate it. Sometimes you do things that are not 100% carnivore, but may increase, efficacy and adherence. So I think that makes a lot of sense and is really intelligent. And can you talk about, why someone may want to, being on a carnivore diet, may want to switch back between carnivore and ketogenic with plant foods, and how you would think about possibly switching between the two?
Yeah, so really, I think that the biggest thing is preference with it. I don't think, based on the reason why we put together that program and a lot of the education we put in there was that it doesn't seem, where we, reviewing the research now, there doesn't seem to be a need for plants in the diet. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't provide benefit, but there doesn't seem to be a need for them because it seems like we can get a lot of the things that we get from the plants from a carnivore diet. So there's probably not necessarily a need to go back to a different style of keto, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want to, like you mentioned, adherence is kind of a big thing. So I always talk about sustainability and adherence is more important than what's the most optimal diet, because I can put together the best diet in the world, but if everybody can't stick to it, then it's not the best diet in the world. So for some people, having salads or having vegetables and having fiber can help promote some satiety, maybe make you feel a little bit more full. It might make you feel like at a meal that you're getting a little bit more out of the meal. And maybe that allows you to, if your goal is calorie restricting, that can allow you to calorie restrict a little bit longer. I think that if you're really low calorie, which you shouldn't be for a very long period of time, but if you are low calorie, doing it on a carnivore could be a little bit more challenging for some people just because of the less volume of food. So that's kind of one of the biggest things, is just if it's something that maybe you do it for a few weeks or a few months to test it out, and then maybe you take a break from it so you can kind of have that mental break and go back to standard keto. That's probably the best reason. But outside of that, I really don't see much of a reason to go back. For me personally, the only thing that I've really done differently from carnivore is started to add in things like avocados, just because they're just really rich in potassium and can help get some more fat in the diet. And so that's kind of something that I've included in my diet. And other than that, stayed pretty carnivore. So I think that, it's one of those things where if you've been following carnivore for a long period of time, I think sometimes people might be afraid to go back that other way. You're probably not going to experience anything too negative going back the other way, other than maybe some, gastrointestinal distress initially if your body kind of isn't used to digesting that fiber anymore. But other than that, I haven't seen anybody complain too much about going back to keto. But, with that being said, there's probably just not a huge necessity to do it unless it's a preference thing.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think it gets back to self-experimentation. Like you said initially, I'm a huge proponent of that. And I think, even switching to a carnivore diet, although people in general probably realize less GI distress and issues with that than with keto or with a diet high in fiber, there still is a transition period going either way. So I think, a lot of times people who are carnivore will try adding one plant food, get some GI distress and say, oh, that plant food is bad forever. But there definitely is sort of a transition period. So I think it may be important to, if you are going to test, which you don't have to, but if you want to reintroduce something, and you have to give your gut a little bit of time to adjust to it. So that's interesting. And I guess we sort of addressed this previously, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper into how do you think a carnivore diet specifically impacts body composition and exercise related results, like the effects on muscle mass and fat loss? How do you think it could be beneficial there?
Yeah, so it's really hard to definitively say because really it's just so variable across each person. And even within a carnivore diet, there's going to be a version of the carnivore diet in terms of where your macronutrients should be at, that's going to put you in the best position to see the best results. So it is kind of challenging with that. But typically, when it comes to body composition with carnivore keto, we see that if you're somebody who's keto adapted already, and you're a pretty effective fat burner, you're pretty effective at producing and utilizing ketones, then I think just traditionally, even outside of carnivore, going the approach of lowering your fat intake a little bit and increasing your protein, I think can help promote some muscle building and help maybe increase your body's reliance on burning more of its own fat, as compared to a traditional ketogenic diet where you're consuming, 75 to 80% of your calories from fat. So I think that that's kind of one of the biggest things. But then also, when we go on a carnivore diet, we're also getting some different types of, probably putting a little bit more of a reliance on some different types of fats in our diet that can have a pretty big impact on our hormone levels. Including things like saturated fat and stuff in our diet can have an impact on that. So I think that that's another big one where between the combination of these fats that are going to help produce hormones, it can be ideal for body composition. Plus the higher protein, a little bit lower fat, I think is just kind of a good recipe for building a little bit of muscle mass and losing some fat. But again, I think it's really specific. And like you said, self-experimentation is the key there, that you really got to make sure that you're tailoring the diet for what your needs are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And would love to get a little bit more into the fat and protein sort of trade-offs. And I know, you do a lot of high mental work, and I've seen, at least from your Instagram, it seems like a lot of times you're working on ways to optimize your mental clarity and your productivity. How do you think about trading off sort of the high ketones, higher fat version of keto and the higher protein, want to build muscle and lose fat and feel full version of keto?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. For me, I think that I'm actually able to achieve both pretty well. But the key here is that I've been doing keto for 3.5 years. So that is kind of something to take into consideration, that I'm probably pretty efficient at, producing and utilizing ketones, even maybe without having a ton of extra fat in my diet. So for me, what I've noticed to still be able to achieve that mental acuity and the just mental sharpness that comes when a lot of people are following the higher fat version of keto, I just incorporated fasting and the MCT oil into it. So that was kind of like, for me, fat fasting is something that I've traditionally used for improving my mental function. It's something that's used with a little bit different goal as compared to just regular fasting alone. But when I was following carnivore keto, that's what I was doing, is I was doing just this fat fast, and then the rest of the day keeping to, those carnivore macronutrients. So I think that, both are able to achieve both, but it also might have there might be at play is how, you know, one of the things I've always said is that for somebody who's brand new, going this carnivore approach, it's some people, they might, it depends what's going to happen if you're new to keto. We don't really know if this carnivore approach is going to be the best thing for you to do right from the start. But if you're somebody who's been keto for a while, I think that it's a pretty easy transition. And I think that you can probably make that switch without having to suffer too much in the mental clarity range of keto.
Right, right. And that's interesting that you incorporate fasting, Chris. Would love to hear a little bit more about how you do that, hours. And also one thing I see asked in the carnivore groups all the time is, should I work out fasted? Should I lift weights fasted? Is it okay? Do I need to have a whey protein shake before? Should I try to eat some food before an early morning workout? How do you sort of incorporate that, or what do you think around there?
Yeah, so I think that, well, I mean, to answer the first question, my fasting protocol, I usually like to follow somewhere between a 16 to a 20 hour. So I'm not much of a, I guess, a pattern person or a strict person. Like if it's noon and I'm hungry and it's been 16 hours, I'll eat. But if I want to push it to 2 o'clock, I'll do that. It's just kind of a preference thing for me. I typically follow that most days of the week. And then on the weekends, usually, it's a little bit shorter. I might go out for brunch or things like that. So that's kind of the fasting protocol that I follow. I actually do train fasted. I play, hours of basketball fasted. I work out fasted, go for runs, bike rides fasted. What I always tell people when it comes to, should you train fasted or not? Again, I think it's all about preference. I don't think we've seen anything in the literature to definitively say that one way is better than the other. So I always tell people you should probably do whatever's going to allow you to train at the highest intensity. I think that, you going into an exercise or you going into a training session with the ability to train at a higher intensity is going to make a much bigger difference than whether or not you're fasted. We just haven't seen great research on what's going to happen when we train fasted. Is it most optimal for fat loss? Is it muscle sparing? In my opinion, I think that it's probably, if it is any of those things, it's probably to a small enough degree that, like I said, being able to train at a better intensity is probably more important. So, for me personally, I actually really enjoy training fasted. I feel like I have a little more energy, a little more mental clarity. But for other people, training fasted may mean that you're groggy, tired. You don't feel like you have really the energy or stamina in you to get through the training session. In that case, consuming food beforehand is probably a little bit better. So, again, I think it's just probably a preference thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love training fasted personally. I have my best workouts that way and don't vomit. So that's good.
Right.
And I'd love to talk a little bit, Chris, about plateaus and weight loss. And you just had an excellent interview with Andy Gustin from Keto Answers podcast all about this. So I'd encourage folks to check that out and don't want to be too redundant here. But I guess I would love to particularly talk about it in the context of a carnivore diet. What are some things that could cause plateaus in weight loss on carnivore? And, where do you think it's necessary to start counting calories or adjusting macros?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think there's a couple of places that a plateau could occur. And some of them are, like you said, are going to be a little bit similar to what we talked about on Dr. Gustin's podcast. But dairy can definitely be a big one. I think for keto in general, dairy can be one of the reasons why you're stuck at a plateau. A lot of people make up for the fact that they can't have certain foods by consuming a ton of cheese or, heavy whipping cream or butter. So I think that can be one of the causes. And I think when we go to a carnivore approach, that's even maybe more prevalent because when you go carnivore, you're obviously cutting out a few more food groups. So people may feel a little more restricted, and that can tend to lead to increases in dairy. So I think dairy is a big one. And then obviously there's some other, things like just not getting enough exercise. I think that sometimes if we're not getting out there and training, we're probably not going to be burning enough calories. And sometimes people may be programmed to not exercise on keto because they can see such great results without doing it that they may get in a bad habit of not doing it. And that can definitely cause a plateau. But one of the other things I think that could be a reason for a plateau is is having a bad balance of, and this is kind of, I know one of the questions you mentioned you want to talk about was something, what was it? I think you had mentioned something about some of the things that are ignored on a carnivore keto diet. And
Yeah.
this is kind of where that comes into play. I think not getting enough omega-3s in can actually cause a plateau. You know, not getting enough omega-3s in can definitely lead to you having a little bit more inflammation. And one of the things that can happen on carnivores, people get so caught up in eating only red meat that they're getting some omega-6s in their diet, but they're not getting enough fish in their diet or supplementing with omega-3s, that they can get a little bit of an imbalance in that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which can be pro-inflammatory. And if there's inflammation in the body, that can definitely be a huge trigger for a plateau. So I think that's another thing to take into consideration.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think those are all good ones. Definitely, I've learned a lot from the program, and also just from following you and some of the things I incorporate around, advancing the basic carnivore diet are, I have sardines 3 to 4 times a week at least. I try to have the eggs 1 or 2 times a week, and I'm also a huge fan of the ancestral supplements liver that you've shown on your Instagram, because I just struggle so much to find good grass-fed liver and cook it in a way that's palatable and time it and dose it. But it's just a lot simpler with those liver tablets. I can just take 6 a day and be on with it. So I think that's really good. And what about counting calories and macros, Chris? When do you think that would be necessary or unnecessary for someone on a carnivore diet?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it probably depends on how long you've been stuck at a plateau. As a rule of thumb for me, I like to try to avoid tracking because I'm all about keto being a lifestyle. So I don't think that tracking your food all of the time is necessarily a lifestyle. Now, it's different if you're trying to shred up for summer or you're trying to achieve some different goal, then tracking can be good for that. But I think it's better to kind of learn to eat intuitively and listen to your body and not have to track. So, one of the things that I always try to do is, is there a way to optimize the diet first? So some of the things that we talked about, like getting enough omega-3s in, maybe cutting your dairy back, getting more exercise in, try to do those things first. And then, if we do get to a point where you need to start looking at your macros and calories, one of the first things that I always recommend is if there's a way that we can increase our calorie burning before we have to cut calories, that's a big thing for me. I think that too often we get in the cycle of just cutting calories, and eventually that's just going to lead to people, you're consuming 1,100 calories and you're not losing weight, and where the heck do you go from there? So I think that, if you're stuck at that plateau, before you go to that route of manipulating your macros too much or lowering your calories, I think it's probably a better approach to see, can you be training a little bit harder? Can you be training a little bit differently? Maybe, incorporating some more high intensity interval training. If you're not resistance training, maybe incorporating some of that, or maybe in some cases, training less. Sometimes they can become overtrained, and that can be something that makes you stuck at a plateau. So I think that that's one big thing to try. And then if you get to that point where you've done that, maybe, before you go into the route of cutting calories and macronutrients, you could consider doing some sort of food sensitivity test. I've seen some stuff where people have reported, some pretty common foods, even just things like chicken or whatever, as being something that promotes a lot of inflammation in certain individuals. So getting a food sensitivity test may be something that, mixed research on it, but that could be something you could do first. And then if you've kind of done all those things and checked the boxes, then you might have to start looking at maybe manipulating those macronutrients or lowering those calories. But I think it's one of those things where, in my opinion, that's kind of a last ditch effort.
Yeah, I think that's really great and responsible advice around making sure you tick all those boxes before forcing yourself into something that's going to really dramatically change your lifestyle.
Right.
Or, that can be argued, but a lot of people don't like tracking. But I'd love to get your take, Chris. You post a lot about adaptogens. We talked a little bit about the ancestral liver supplement. What other supplements do you think are beneficial on a carnivore ketogenic diet, or most beneficial, I'll say?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, definitely if you're somebody who doesn't like fish, I think that you probably need to consider an omega supplement, whether that's fish oil or krill oil. If you're not eating any fish, you probably want to consider something like krill oil that has a little bit more omega-3. The adaptogens, there's a few different adaptogens that I like to take. I'm a really big fan of some of the adaptogenic mushrooms like the cordyceps and chaga and lion's mane, reishi, some of those. So I think that those are good for, and for everybody out there who doesn't know adaptogens, I mean, basically adaptogens, just like they sound, they're things that are able to adapt to the needs of our bodies. So they can provide just so many different benefits depending on what we need. So I really like, the adaptogenic mushrooms, and then also just other adaptogens like, rhodiola or ashwagandha. I like to include those as well. But then it kind of depends if you're somebody, if you're trying to stay with that strict carnivore approach, you might not want it. Maybe you're not considering things like exogenous ketones. I think exogenous ketones make a really nice supplement to a ketogenic diet if they're used the right way and used strategically. So that's the one thing that you can always throw in there. And then, like you said, I think that the ancestral supplements are pretty great too, because those, a lot, like you said, a lot of people don't like consuming liver or different organ meats. So getting it in supplement form can definitely help with that. And those are such nutrient dense foods that if we could find a way to incorporate those despite not liking the taste, then that's going to be a great thing.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And one thing I always struggle with, I've experimented with probably all of the ones you mentioned, is a lot of times, at least maybe I'm just being a lazy consumer here, but it's hard to find evidence-based information on the quantitative effect of some of these things. So I'll give an example. People say things like ashwagandha increases testosterone or something like that, but they often won't say what the increase is. So sometimes they do, and a lot of times you can find the studies yourself. But just as sort of a straw man, if ashwagandha, raised my testosterone by 2%, I don't think I would go out and start taking it. Both because of the cost and any potential, side effects. But if it was 200%, then hey, I'd be really interested in that. So I just find it interesting with a lot of these things like, MCT oil increases ketone production. A lot of the statements that are made, I think they're really compelling, and people can definitely look into the science themselves, but a lot of times they're not attached to a number.
Yeah, I think you definitely make a good point, and really quantifying the numbers is nearly impossible because of all the variability between between subjects and between people. But I think a lot of times you have to look at in some of those situations, like the robust list of the different benefits. Like, if you look at something like coconut oil, for instance, like maybe we're not able to quantify the amount of ketone production that can occur, but we do know that coconut oil, the lauric acid that we find in there is antimicrobial, antibacterial, antiviral. Same thing with ashwagandha. Maybe we're not going to see a dramatic increase, or we can't quantify the increase in testosterone. But we do know that we've seen that it can start lowering cortisol levels, and it's been pretty traditionally used as a anti-anxiety or antidepressive agent. So I think that it's kind of one of those things that when you look at some of these products and you see a pretty long list of benefits, it's similar to like creatine, for instance. Like it's pretty hard to quantify what increase in muscle mass you may experience from taking creatine, but we know that taking creatine can help provide you with some fuel. It can provide some substance for brain health and things like that. So even though maybe we can't always quantify it, I think that depending on what the research says, there's still reason to include some of those things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I wouldn't dismiss them based on that fact. I was just thinking about it the other day. I was actually listening to a podcast with Ben Bickman talking about increasing brown fat, and I think his research is awesome and fascinating, and definitely there's a case to do things that increase brown fat. But part of me in the back of my mind wondered, how much is increasing brown fat, and how much does increasing brown fat actually, increase our body's ability to burn fat for fuel and things like that. Because a lot of these are just made as qualitative statements. So it just made me sort of think about, that sort of whole area of health in general.
Yeah, no, you're definitely not wrong. I mean, it is really hard. And that's kind of one of the problems with research in general is that, there's a lot of times that, a study can find something to any degree and we can blow it up or dismiss it, depending on, how we want to interpret it and how we want to spread the information. So you're definitely not wrong in that. It's pretty hard to, I think a lot of times what's worth assessing, like, if you're trying to figure out the best supplement to include in your diet, well, you probably want to look at the supplements that probably have the most research behind them, because those are going to be the ones that, you're probably going to be able to better assess what they're going to do for your body. But, some of these random supplements that come out, or random ingredients that, promise doing this and this, but the research is a little bit unclear on it, then yeah, it's probably, those might be the ones that you want to wait for there to be a little bit more research on there before you make a decision on them.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And Chris, something that's sort of central to a lot of these things we've been talking about, weight loss, exercise, etc., is hormones. So I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about the effects on hormones of a standard American diet versus a carnivore or keto diet, just sort of at a high level.
Yeah. So, just basically speaking, we need fat for hormone production. It's really important. When we follow a standard American diet, we traditionally are consuming, we've been trained to consume lower fat, higher carb. So, typically we're not getting enough dietary fat in there, and that's going to be a big limiting factor for some hormone production. But there's also just a lot of other things that happen when we're following a standard American diet, like just insulin resistance and inflammation that can play a big role on our hormone levels as well. So, when we switch to a ketogenic diet, to put it pretty simply, we're providing a lot more fat, which can, help aid in that hormone production. But we're also, making a big step towards reducing inflammation and improving our insulin sensitivity. So that's just going to be an overall contributor to it. And, for a lot of people too, that increase in energy there's some effects that we can't necessarily definitively state them, because you following a carnivore keto or a ketogenic diet, if that gives you more energy and gets you in the gym training more, then that's going to help with your hormone levels. If we're dropping body fat percentage, that's obviously going to help with our hormone levels. So there's kind of a lot of benefits that come with it long term as well. But traditionally right away, like when we start including more fat in our diet, I think that can make a pretty robust difference in our hormone production.
Yeah, I like that. I like how you describe the sort of cascade effects that can't necessarily be sussed out at first glance from changing a diet. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think a lot of people, what's remarkable to me, switching to keto or carnivore, all of a sudden want to exercise and all of a sudden have all this energy to do things both physically and mentally that they never thought they could before or wanted to before. So that's really powerful. And then another topic I've heard you touch on before, Chris, and is really a passion of mine, I'm obsessed with it, is sleep. So would love to talk a little bit about, some of the things you do to optimize sleep. And then maybe we can go from there.
Yeah, definitely. So sleep is another big one when it comes to being stuck at a plateau. If you're not getting quality sleep and quality recovery for your body, it's definitely hard to put your body through a lot of changes. It can be a little bit more resistant to that. So sleep is one of the biggest things. Everybody knows that sleep's important. It's no novel thought to say that, oh, you got to get sleep. We all know that. But until you actually understand what happens when you don't get enough sleep and what the long-term compounding effects of not getting sleep is, it's pretty hard to really get behind, optimizing it. And one big thing to point out with optimizing it is that there's a big difference between sleep quantity and sleep quality. And that's something that, when I was in grad school, one of the first things I started researching was circadian rhythms. And that was kind of the first realization that I realized is that, just because you're getting 7-8 hours of sleep doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the best quality of sleep. If you're not achieving that REM sleep, or you're not going through the different sleep cycles as you should be, then it's not necessarily the right quality. So, and to kind of say that kind of leads into what I do for it. So a couple changes that I make right away to just help optimize my sleep is I try to limit my caffeine consumption after 3:00. That's a really big one for me, just to make sure that I'm not stimulating my body too much, and my brain, my heart and everything too much, where I'm going to have a hard time going to sleep afterwards. The other things I try to do is really limit my blue light exposure as the evening comes on. So, I have all of my devices set to remove the blue light out as the day goes on, kind of switching into that nighttime mode. Using blue light blockers is another thing that you can do to kind of limit that. So those are a couple things there. And then, not sleeping with the TV on, not having your phone anywhere near you or having it, the screen completely covered up is a big thing. One of the things we know that even when you're sleeping, having blue lights, having your eyes exposed to blue light, even when your eyelids are closed, you can still kind of throw off your circadian rhythms, and that can impair your sleep. So you definitely want to optimize your sleep environment as well. So a couple other things that go along with that is, achieving optimal darkness, trying to, whether you're wearing a mask or blackout shades, making sure that you're sleeping in a cool environment. Those are all things that I try to focus on. Another thing is that, later in the evening, if say I train later in the evening, this is one of the things I think I actually got this from Ben Greenfield in one of the podcasts I listened to his, but, as part of our circadian rhythms, typically I think our body temperature starts to lower as the evening comes. So if we train in the evening, that's obviously going to raise our core body temperature. So if I do train in the evening, I'll try to do something to cool my body down, like an ice bath or a cold shower or something to get that body temperature down to help sleep. So those are kind of the big ones that I try to take without using supplementation. And then, if typically that's enough for me to achieve pretty great sleep quality. And then outside of that, and another thing that I throw in there too, that we talked about on the podcast with Dr. Gustin was doing a little bit of reading and stuff before bed. So one of my really good friends, Jake Rauch, recommended to me doing some fictional reading before bed to kind of help, pull your mind away from work or, from the busyness of your day and to help relax a little bit. So I kind of try to incorporate a routine with all of those strategies in my evening to make sure that I'm getting not only that, like I said, that sleep quantity, but also that sleep quality.
Yeah, those are all excellent suggestions. And I definitely have some questions for you, but I'll just throw in a couple more for folks that I practice. One is I always wear earplugs to bed. Bothers some people, but in an average night, you'll probably be woken up once by some noise. So that can be helpful. I have a chili pad, which I love, because I run really hot. So even with my AC on full blast, it's not cold enough for me.
Right.
So that definitely helps. And then, I recently got a weighted blanket, which might sound strange, but, for me, it feels like it works just having extra weight on you without it being really hot. It's this special blanket that has like weights in it. It's more comfortable than I'm describing, but I found that's actually improved my sleep quality somewhat as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And then one thing I noticed on a carnivore diet, a lot of people talk about their sleep improving, and mine has and has not. My energy on days when I get less sleep is definitely higher on carnivore than keto. But when I was on a ketogenic diet, I was able to eat dinner at 6 or 7 p.m., a large dinner, and still sleep very well. On carnivore, I found, I have to basically cut off food before 6 p.m. Otherwise, I can't really get deep sleep. Is that something you've encountered or I know that might have to do with circadian rhythm, but what do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I personally haven't experienced that. Sleep in keto is a challenging topic because there's such mixed things. I mean, some people report not getting good sleep. Some people report getting great sleep. A lot of it can have to do with so many different things like, your electrolyte levels and other things like stimulants that you're consuming throughout the day and stuff. So there's a lot of factors at play. I haven't noticed any impairments in my sleep from time that I eat. I mean, I do tend to eat a little bit later in the evening because of my schedule. That's just kind of when I get a chance to sit down and have dinner, and I haven't noticed anything personally. But I can definitely see it. I mean, when you're consuming food later in the night, that is definitely going to have an impact on your circadian rhythms to some extent. So for some people that may be a little more sensitive to that could cause some problems. But I haven't seen it too much myself.
Yeah. And then on the supplement front, a couple things I wanted to touch on, Chris. One is, in the Carnivore Keto Cut program, you talk a lot about electrolytes and emphasize electrolytes. why do you think that's essential? And do you think folks can get away with a carnivore program where they're, mostly eating meat, adding a light amount of salt to their food, or do they really need to supplement more with potassium and magnesium and potentially for sleep reasons, among others?
I think, I do think the electrolytes are important on any keto diet, whether it's carnivore or not. Because one of the science behind that, for anybody who's unfamiliar with it, is when we consume a low carbohydrate diet, our blood glucose lowers, our insulin levels lower, and that can cause us to excrete a little bit more water, which is also going to allow to us becoming a little bit deficient in our electrolytes. So that's kind of a big one on keto in general. It's one of the primary supplements that I recommend people taking is an electrolyte supplement. And, when you're following a carnivore diet, it can be a little more challenging because, if you're following a standard, traditional ketogenic diet, you can include things like avocados or nuts that can give you some of those electrolytes that you're trying to get. But on carnivore, when you're cutting those out, it can be a little bit more challenging. So it is one of those things that I recommend taking. I think that most times when people report any feelings of discomfort on keto, it's probably related to some particular micronutrient deficiency, probably related to electrolytes. So I think it's just kind of one of those essential things that there's not going to be any damage done from you taking them. So it's one of those things where it's probably just going to be in your best benefit to take them. And the supplements for these things are pretty cheap. So I really think there's probably not a reason to avoid them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely go back and forth on the topic. I've recently talked to guests about, sometimes I feel like I'm adding way too much salt and then throwing my electrolytes out of balance. Worrying about getting enough potassium, but I don't want to overdo potassium. So it's definitely something I go back and forth on. And then one more quick one on sleep, Chris, is what do you think about taking small doses of melatonin for sleep?
Yeah, that's another good question. The problem is we don't really know. Melatonin's been shown to be safe. We just don't know if there's really a long-term implication for our circadian rhythms with that. Melatonin is something that our body produces naturally, or at least it should produce naturally if we have our circadian rhythms up to par. So it's hard to determine. Now, one thing I can say for sure is that if you're somebody who's maybe you're a night shift worker, or you're somebody who's traveling a lot, or you work late in the evening and have no choice but to be exposed to a lot of blue light, then melatonin, I think, is something that can be important because you gotta get that sleep quality up somehow, and that can probably help. I think sleep supplements, I'm one of those people, I'm like minimal effective dose. I think that if you can try using, supplementing with some magnesium, or use some of these tips that we talked about for improving your sleep first, I think that's better. But if you have to resort to using some melatonin, I think it's something you can incorporate. And then, maybe it's in your best interest to get off of it. I think it's kind of yet to be said what the long term is if we start taking it frequently. I kind of feel like maybe it's something that we can become a little bit dependent on. And even if it's not necessarily dependent on it physiologically, there could be a mental dependence on it, which, in my opinion, that's why the placebo effect is so robust sometimes, right? If we think something's going to give us good sleep and we don't take it, are we not going to get good sleep because of it? So I think it's one of those things, just teaching your body not to become dependent on anything related to sleep, I think is important, but it can definitely still play a role.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then another one I wanted to ask about earlier, but you just reminded me of, is you talked about cooling down before bed and the Ben Greenfield cold shower. I've heard a ton of people have success with that, take a short ice bath before bed, or just hop in a cold shower before bed if your body's too hot. But I've also heard people, and I think there was a sleep doctor on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about the opposite, which is taking a warm shower, a warm bath right before bed, and your body almost has a compensatory mechanism to cool yourself down. Both could make sense to me theoretically, but I've heard about people using the cold more, so that's interesting.
That is interesting.
I'm curious, do you use saunas at all, Chris?
Yeah, I do. I haven't until recently, to be honest. I've never really liked them much. Traditionally, I've always was pretty uncomfortable going into them, but I started kind of just sucking it up because of a lot of the benefits that you hear from people like Dr. Rhonda Patrick and all of them talking about these benefits from using sauna. So I started incorporating them and been doing it pretty frequently. And I actually like it now. Like I said, I didn't really like it before, but I'm a pretty big fan of it now. But I've been doing that for probably, a little bit more recent in my journey, probably within the last like 6 months that I started really including it more frequently.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, this has been wonderful and really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all this information. I guess I'd just love to close by asking, what are some of the goals for your website and the Carnivore Keto program? Where can people find that and find out more about you?
Yeah, so the biggest goal with the Ketologist from the start has been easy, sustainable keto. It's just finding a way for first of all, giving people an easy way to start a ketogenic diet without too much of the confusion or, giving them the education to go through some of the hardships of starting keto. That's kind of one of the primary focuses, is just kind of making it easy for those people who are coming to the diet for the first time. And then also it's kind of just the point of trying to disseminate information and bring down, one of the first goals that I had with the Ketologist was taking the great research that's being done by all these amazing scientists out there and, packaging in a way that is better understood by the general population so that they can understand, what's going on in these keto for cancer studies or these keto for Alzheimer's studies and things like that. So that's kind of the overall goal with keto, with the website, is just, being able to help and be a guide along the way for people who are on their keto journeys. For the Carnivore Keto Cut, that's kind of one of those ones where the biggest reason why we put that together was for some education, because a lot of people were starting to follow the diet, but there wasn't a ton of education on it when we started talking about it. So that was one of the biggest reasons for that. And I also think that the Carnivore Keto program can be a great approach for somebody who is stuck at a plateau. If you've been following a traditional ketogenic diet, making that switch to carnivore may be a thing that can help bust through a plateau. So I think that's another one of the reasons. That was one of the goals that we had with it. So, and you can find that on the Carnivore Keto Cut website, which I'm not sure if you have show notes or something like that. You can put that in, but
absolutely.
So that's the place that you can find that. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. I'll link to all of that and all your social media in the show notes. And I think you're doing a fantastic job of, just like you said, distilling a lot of the science that's out there and information and making it accessible for people. So I have to thank you for that and really appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Scott. I had a great time.
Yeah, of course. Bye, Chris. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Carnivore Cast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.